Welcome to our conference call on the textile ecosystem in the Carolinas and Central America. We're going to be covering today the sort of national security implications of the textile and apparel industry and fraud in the cotton supply chain. I'm Neil Tracey. I'm a correspondent here at the Capitol Forum, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Beth Baltzan, who's a senior advisor at the Capitol Forum. Before coming to us, Beth was the counselor for trade and investment at USTR, following a whole host of different roles in trade policy. Beth and I are joined today by Davis Warlick, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Parkdale Mills, which is the world's leading manufacturer of spun yarns. Davis brings a deep experience from a company that has been really a driver of innovation in textile manufacturing for over a century, and really has placed a strong emphasis on research and development. And my understanding, and Davis, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the vast majority of Parkdale's operations are in the US, but Parkdale also operates some in Mexico and Central America. So speaking with Davis is really going to offer us, I think, a unique perspective on the evolving challenges in the cotton and apparel supply chain. So I'm very excited for this conversation. Beth and Davis, thank you so much for joining us.
Neil, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, Beth, maybe I'll kick it over to you if you want to start out and ask Davis. I know you had some ideas.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that introduction, Neil. Great to see you as always. Davis, I wonder if you could help us. A lot of Americans and people generally, I don't think appreciate that we still have a robust textile and apparel industry in the United States. And a lot of it is right in the Carolinas where you are, and you're an important part of it. I wonder if you could basically give us a primer on textile and apparel manufacturing in the US.
Sure. You know, textiles is everywhere. It's been an industry that United States has competed and been a part of for, hundreds of years. Our company, Parkdale Mills, we were founded in 1916 here in Gastonia, North Carolina. Most of our mills were in the Carolinas over the last 100 years, but now we've grown more globally. We operate textile manufacturing facilities in 6 countries. We operate facilities in 7 states. We've diversified a little bit, not just in yarn manufacturing and textile manufacturing, but also in cotton, health, and beauty products. And so we're a part of a pretty vast supply chain. In the United States, it truly is end to end. We have 500,000 employees in the U.S. textile supply chain. We make 8,000 different products for the United States military. It's definitely not your grandmother's cotton mill anymore. I mean, this is a extremely high-tech industry that makes applications for the aerospace, for military, for apparel, of course, home and bed products, automotive. So it really covers a wide range of products and sectors. And we do that very well in the United States.
Thank you for that. So maybe we can go back to the pandemic, because all of a sudden we found ourselves unable to access masks, personal protective equipment. People on the front lines of the health crisis were dying. How did your industry respond?
I think that was a really difficult time for everybody, but if there was one thing I was so proud to be a part of was the response we had in the United States to that pandemic, and especially being a part of the U.S. textile industry during that period of time. Just like many things that we, starting to realize, if you offshore everything, including PPE, in times of need, it's going to be very difficult to verticalize and to respond. And I think that's one of the reasons that U.S. textile industry historically has always been the backbone of defense, and that's healthcare and military. Our business was started in 1916 making thread for the World War I effort. And every war and every pandemic since, the United States textile industry has stepped up and answered the call. The pandemic was no different. We went from not being able to access the most basic inputs of PPE, the man-made fibers, the non-wovens, the raw materials that go into it. Most of all of that supply chain was established in Asia. And when you had a global pandemic like we did, that put our citizens at risk. Basically overnight, with the help of the NCTO, which is our lobbyist group, and many other textile organization groups with the administration, pulled together a response that within days had the entire supply chain end to end across the entire country making face masks, making gowns, making swabs, testing swabs. One of our companies, US Cotton, was making the diagnostic COVID swabs. Some of the companies that competed generally in a competitive market were all working together to kind of pull together that supply chain. And I think a lot of the workers in the American textile industry were heroes during that period of time because of the response.
That's amazing. So when we talk about manufacturing in the United States, and in the last 10 years, we've seen a real focus on too much of manufacturing in the United States being offshored, and that we need to have manufacturing here at home. I've been surprised because in the conversation we've had over the last, say, 6 months, the conversation around manufacturing from a lot of economists and academics seems to go out of its way to say that we don't need to make textiles and apparel in the United States, that it is your grandmother's industry, that these are low-tech jobs, that we ought to offshore and focus on other things. And I wonder what your response is to that.
It's relevant that you brought that up because we've heard it in the news and the media recently about our industry in general. And I think there's just a general misperception about the industry, which is unfortunate. I think of the U.S. textile industry as an innovation powerhouse. I think of it as a tech industry. And you say, well, why do you think that? If you look at the amount of polymer and fiber technology that this industry is creating, people start to realize it's a lot more than just yarns and fabrics for socks. That this industry is a huge supplier to the United States military, aerospace. You think about some of the great innovations that we all benefit from today started in the United States and started with textile companies. You look at polyester, nylon, Kevlar, all these innovative products that keep our frontline workers safe, that we wear, that fill our closets. A lot of that innovation was started here in the United States. And unfortunately, the innovation was created here, but some of the supply chains have been built elsewhere. But I think back to your point, it is so critical to have a U.S. Textile manufacturing base. I mean, it is a critical industry, and I can't say that clear enough. U.S. textiles is a critical industry, not just for the response with the military and all those products, but it's a huge employer with 500,000 employees throughout the United States that are in the textile industry. We are the second largest textile exporter in the world. Our industry is. And so we are exporting, like our company, exporting into the CAFTA region, into the Western Hemisphere, into Mexico. Our industry, every job that we create in the manufacturing, domestic manufacturing industry is a 3-to-1 multiplier. So it's a great job multiplier, and it's a very critical industry, I think. I think there's also a perception that I think I'll actually quote Andy Warlick, who's our chairman. He talks about like Baskin Robbins, and he says, hey, look, for Baskin-Robbins to be innovative and have all the flavors that it has when you walk in the door, you have to be able to make the vanilla and the chocolate as well, because those are the flavors that really help create the capital and things to invest in all the innovation and all the other flavors that they offer. I use that example is because, yes, we can produce very low cost inputs for socks, for hosiery, for t-shirts. But at the same point in time, if we don't have that base load, we're not able to do the innovation that I mentioned earlier, fiber and polymer technology, aerospace, the things we're doing in carbon fibers. All of that has to kind of work together so that we have a really strong domestic textile base that can lead the world in innovation. But at the same point in time, we need the vanilla and the chocolate, capabilities as well.
So does that mean for those who would say, oh, great, well, we should have a textile apparel that focuses only on national security, is that just not enough to keep the whole system going?
I don't think so. I certainly think that you have to have a strong base. You want the best engineers, you want the best entrepreneurs investing here in the United States, and by having a large base load, like what we have at Parkdale. We're one of the largest yarn manufacturing companies in the Western Hemisphere. We invest heavily in our facilities in automation. Beth, you've visited our facilities. You've seen the amount of technology, AGVs, robotics that we have in our facilities. Those facilities can run commodity types of products at very low cost, as low cost inputs within the apparel supply chain, textile supply chain. But at the same point in time, one of our facilities additionally is making yarns for the military. It's making yarns for upholstery fabrics that go into automotive, to the automotive industry, for aerospace. And so by being able to have the expertise in that base load to be able to, be a part of a commodity type of supply chain allows us to invest in the technology and the automation to do those other critical components. So I do think that's why, in general, I 100% believe that the U.S. textiles is a critical industry. If we can't make it here, how can we protect here? And to be able to make it here, we have to be able to have a level playing field globally to be able to produce those types of commodity types of products and the products that help spur the innovation.
That's super interesting. Beth, I hope you don't mind if I jump in quickly, because this reminds me of a lot of different conversations that we've been having recently, really concerning labor as well, and how if you offshore some of these jobs, you were talking about it being you need the engineers, right? Can you speak a little bit more about how if you offshore some of these jobs, you lose that expertise and that labor, and that you can't, that doesn't just come back like that? I think that's a really interesting point, and it ties into a lot of things that I've been hearing.
I think that definitely happens. I think if you look at just on the R&D side, something that we do currently today, we spend a lot of money on R&D trying to create new polymer and fiber technology, and some of the capabilities on manufacturing have gone overseas. And for us to be able to produce the latest, greatest type of polymer and fiber technology, it has been very difficult. Some of that expertise that was here potentially, in the 60s and 70s, when you had companies like DuPont that were creating Kevlar and spandex and polyester nylon, some of those really innovative fibers that we all use today, some of that expertise is not here, and some of that manufacturing capability is not here, which is unfortunate, to be able to actually commercialize some new technologies. And so I think if you don't have a base and you don't have the expertise, the next latest, greatest U.S. patented technology that could benefit the military, could benefit first line, frontline employees, frontline workers, that we may not be able to commercialize that product unless we have that expertise, unless we have that capability. So we certainly don't want to lose that. But we have seen a shift where certain countries in certain parts of the world try to verticalize the entire process and go about it within any means to do so. And I do think that that outsourcing, you're not just outsourcing the last mile when you do that. You're potentially outsourcing the IP that goes with it, and you're also losing that kind of technical know-how and expertise when you do things like that.
Davis, you used the phrase level playing field, and I wonder if you could explain what you mean by that.
I think it means, it's obviously right now with the media and things that are going on, you're hearing a lot more about, tariffs and trade, probably more than we have in 20 or 30 years. And level playing field can mean a lot to different people, but for us, just in our perspective, nothing more than I want to do is create more U.S. jobs and support our workers in our facilities. And so trying to find export markets, new markets to sell our products is challenging if there's not a fair playing field. And we're hearing the term reciprocity. A lot of the countries that do similar products to us have lower duties, lower barriers of entry to get into the United States, which is the largest market for the types of products that we produce. If we were to try to export our products into those markets, we would be hit with a lot of different tariffs, VATs, currency devaluation, different things that make it very unfortunate and unfair to be able to ship our product on a level playing field to a country that has access to our markets. And so, one of our strategies as a company, and when we've seen this shift since the 90s with China joining the WTO, this kind of trade liberalization, globalization movement that started happening in the late 90s, that really impacted the U.S. textile industry. But companies like ours started reinvesting back in technology, understanding that maybe there wasn't a level playing field, that there was going to be a new norm. We started investing heavily in our technology and automation to be able to compete. But at the same point in time, we started investing in free trade agreements in which we thought there was rules of origin, like CAFTA, like USMCA, NAFTA. In the 90s, when it was passed, there was, Ross Perot has some famous commentary about the vacuum and all the jobs that are going away. We reinvested in the United States, and we started looking at, hey, how can we be more active in those countries in those regions in which we think there is a level playing field, there is rules of origin, trade rules, rules that match our values as a United States manufacturer. And so our strategy has been more not only reinvesting in the United States, but also reinvesting in the countries in which we do believe we have a level playing field with, and in hoping trade policy and things like that can help level the playing field with the countries that don't have those rules of origin and some of those FTAs.
I think in some cases, there's an assumption that every domestic manufacturer only wants to make in the United States and doesn't engage in trade policy. But you're an example of a company that has been supportive of the right kind of trade agreement. You use the phrase rules of origin. For people who don't know what that means, those are the supply chain rules that tell you essentially how much production has to happen in a combination of the United States and those free trade agreement partners, whether it's Central America, whether it's Mexico and Canada. And those rules were designed specifically for textiles to incentivize production in the region. And that's an example, I think, curious for your views, about a tool that can create nearshoring opportunities, which is supposed to be one of the lessons from the pandemic. We want things closer to home for all sorts of reasons, that resilience piece, moving away from having these far-flung supply chains. Um, Are you seeing that opportunity in other places? What is your experience with these supply chain rules? Are they holding tight? What would you like to see in that space?
I would say it's a huge priority for us to make sure that those free trade agreements, CAFTA, USMCA, keep those rules of origin, and all the labor, the environmental, all the things that we value here in the United States, consumers value. We want to make sure that that there are rules that every company that's a part of those free trade agreements and supply chains are upholding. And so, we have invested, like currently we're investing in Honduras right now for a very automated facility that is a part of a vast supply chain of great companies that do the fabrics, the knits, the wovens, the cutting and sewing, the dyeing, the finishing. I mean, it is a multi-step supply chain. So for instance, with CAFTA, we're able to produce and export about 70 to 80% of the products that we make in the United States into CAFTA or USMCA. Our yarns are transformed into fabrics, potentially in one of the countries that's a part of that supply chain. It may be dyed in another, cut and sewn in another country, but they're all within the CAFTA and they all adhere to the rules that have been established in terms of rules of origin, where you can get your raw materials from, where certain parts of the supply chain, the production rules in the supply chain, labor, environmental, and that there's supposed to be levers in a framework to make sure that people are in compliance with that. And if they are in compliance, then they're able to get duty-free access back into the United States and they get the benefit. So it's I think a great collaboration for the United States and with those partnering companies. Everybody knows the rules. Everybody should adhere to the rules and be compliant. And if we do that, we can see what we've experienced, which is heavy investment in the United States in one of the critical steps of the supply chain, and other investment from our customers, which we have great customers, world-class apparel, textile manufacturers that are invested in the Western Hemisphere, producing the fabrics and then thus creating apparel. So I give the example, we have an incredible cotton farming industry in the United States. One of the fourth largest growers of cotton globally. That supply chain, we buy that cotton from those farmers, supporting those farmers. We convert that cotton and that fiber into yarn. We export that into Central America, for instance, maybe Honduras, where fabric transformation occurs, and it comes back to the United States in the form of socks, of t-shirts. But with the investment that's been happening in Central America, which we hope there is going to be a lot more, the region can do a lot more than the basics, than socks and t-shirts. And I think the nearshoring effort is critical. And I think the Western Hemisphere is a perfect place for brands, retailers, and companies to be investing in, because to Beth, to your point, you're going to get the resiliency, lead times, you have the expertise and the know-how, and the cost. I mean, so many people talk about the cost differences from the 90s to now. If you look at the Western Hemisphere and you look at what has occurred in Asia with increasing prices, some of the things that put American manufacturers in the Western Hemisphere at a disadvantage maybe 10, 15 years ago, I don't think that's the case anymore. And I think the nearshoring effort and kind of the U.S. reshoring effort is dependent on moving more critical mass into the Western Hemisphere.
So I'd love, maybe this is a good time to segue a little bit into some of the challenges that you've seen in terms of enforcing those rules of origin, making sure that they're being followed. Do you see, generally, do you see those rules of origin being followed, or do you see any cotton coming in or other products coming in and sort of abusing those rules of origin?
I can't speak for I can only speak for ourselves and our customers and in the supply chains that we work within, which majority of that is domestic, USMCA, CAFTA, in which there are a lot of rules that have to be adhered to, and we have to be compliant. Most of all the supply chains that we operate in, I would say 100% follow those rules. I think in general, anytime that you have multi-step supply chains and globalization, it becomes very difficult, I think, to track transparency. I believe it becomes hard to be able to understand who, what, where the inputs are coming from. And I think that opens you up to a lot of fraud opportunities. We have so many companies I know that want to do well. They want to follow the rules, but just inherently how complex these supply chains are, where you've got multiple steps in a supply chain. For instance, in the textiles, fiber, yarn, fabric, cutting and sewing, multiple steps, multiple companies, and potentially multiple countries doing the different formation before it becomes a finished garment. When you have that many steps, it creates a lot of complexity, and I think it opens yourself up for potential for fraud, for bad actors to act. The enforcement, to be able to enforce what I would hope we could do with customs, at least in the trade agreements that we operate in, we need probably more investment from Customs and Border Patrol to be able to have more advanced types of technology to be able to understand where everything came in the supply chain to make sure everybody's complicit. I think that's an opportunity for us as a country to do that. You're seeing some of the other areas that have been kind of utilized to get around some of that. You saw de minimis has become a big talking point on the Hill. We have 4 million packages, I think, coming in daily that are kind of under $800 that aren't getting, not being processed through Customs and Border Patrol just because they don't have enough resources to do so. A lot of those packages are apparel. You've seen a lot of companies that popped up, especially during the pandemic, that are utilizing that loophole to basically have a free trade agreement with the United States and to kind of back end their way into the market undetected. And so that is a problem that, speaking on enforcement, that's a loophole that hopefully this administration is going to get closed so that we can have better transparency and understand what's actually coming in.
Yeah.
Davis, could you explain just a little bit more what de minimis is? Because you live and breathe it every day, but I'm not sure other folks know exactly how it works or doesn't work.
It was described to me, when it was put in, I think back in the 40s, I'm not exactly sure, but the term de minimis, it was referring, your grandmother, when she went on the cruise, did we really need to tax her on the puka shell necklace that she got, in Aruba? And so that was kind of the intent, de minimis. But in the United States, for instance, over the years, our de minimis dollar amount went from very de minimis or very minimal up to $800. And so at $800, what we started seeing is a lot of product, a lot of the direct-to-consumer types of business models were using de minimis to basically evade some of the tax that they would be subject to based on duties, tariffs, things like that. And of course, when there's a dollar amount that large, it really fueled, I think, a lot of the, like I said, 4 million packages coming in daily. under the de minimis kind of loophole. If I were to ship products, let's say similarly to China, their de minimis is $8, ours is $800. And so a lot of companies have grown based on this, basically tax-free, duty-free, free trade agreement with China, for instance, who's using it to ship products directly to consumers' doors here in the United States.
So that's sort of what we've seen with Shein and Temu and those types of companies.
I think those are the companies that have benefited from that. But again, when we go back and talk about transparency and the reasons why I think, the CAFTA rules-based trade bilateral agreements are so important, there's a lot of things that we're missing by having things like de minimis at $800. Neil, you mentioned something about cotton earlier. We know in some parts of the world, news is out about some practices in terms of how people farm cotton, or how some certain areas around the world in terms of cotton growth. That is a way for all that to go undetected. And so we think about us as consumers here in the United States. We think about the companies that operate here well in the United States. A lot of the rules and values we have on sustainability, on labor, when you can't trace something like that, you're opening yourself to importing it in. And sustainability issues, labor, human rights issues, you're opening yourself up to be able to import that in, even though you may be against it here in the United States, which I would think that we all are. Loopholes like that allow us to import those bad behaviors into the country.
Yeah, can you spell out a little bit more some of those? Because I think that's a interesting contrast what you were talking with some of these CAFTA and USMCA providing rules that everybody has to follow in terms of labor standards and environmental standards. Can you spell out a little bit more some of those bad practices that maybe you see outside of the USMCA or CAFTA in places like China? I know, right, like the Uyghur forced labor obviously is front of mind for a lot of people. Can you spell out a little bit more, beyond that, what sort of labor and environmental practices sort of concern you within those supply chains?
I think it starts with, going back to the traceability side. You mentioned the Uyghur issue. That's something that's been heightened over the last couple of years. Again, we don't have any experience with that necessarily. All of our cotton is grown in the United States. And the U.S. is a great example of business, government kind of working together and benefiting. In the United States, we have the USDA that classes every single bale of cotton grown in the United States. When we class it, we're taking samples from every pound of fiber grown in the United States, creating an identification number, the specs, the quality, all of that, and passing it along into the buyer, essentially. That allows that traceability of the raw material. We're the 4th largest grower, so in the world, most of our cotton is exported. We consume all U.S. grown cotton, export our yarns into CAFTA and into USMCA. I give that example because in USMCA, for instance, it's a fiber forward rules of origin agreement, meaning that starting at the fiber, Mexico, Canada, United States, the participating countries have to use inputs grown in one of those countries. In CAFTA, for instance, it's yarn, meaning that the yarn has to originate in one of the participating countries. The fiber and the yarn is basically the first and second step of a pretty vast supply chain. So it's requiring that upfront investment be made on the front end all the way throughout the entire supply chain to be compliant and to get the free duty and trade access. Some of the practices, again, not that we have experience, but we've heard about from other industry groups and through CBP, for instance. We have a pretty antiquated I guess, border enforcement framework. We have certificates of origins, we have documentation that is submitted to be able to kind of map out each step of the process. I think that complexity and the lack of technology that's in that space opens us up for some fraud, where it is very difficult to track where were your inputs from, which country, which supplier, who was the importer on record. There's a lot of opportunities, I think, there for fraud, just by having kind of an antiquated customs and border patrol framework. We have things like blockchain that are being established out there in other industries. Would love to see that, just to make sure that the best companies that are following the rules, aren't scarred by the very few bad actors that are out there that are trying to bypass things.
Yeah. Yeah. Beth, I'd love to get your take on some of this too, because when we're speaking about this sort of transshipment of cotton maybe getting, thrown in and mixed in with cotton that is USMCA or CAFTA compliant. How do you sort of work with other countries to try and make sure that you're working right? Your Customs and Border Patrol and the sort of similar agencies in other countries are working together in order to address this issue? Because I think, given your time in government, speaking to some of those sort of collaboration issues, I think that'd be very interesting to hear from you.
One of the real challenges we've encountered in trade over the past 10 to 15 years is shifting away from the idea that the purpose of customs and border protection is to facilitate trade. It used to be called the customs service. And sometimes you got the feeling that they were service oriented towards the importer. And that meant there was a real devaluation of the enforcement side of the equation, especially as we had the war on drugs and then 9/11. And a lot of the attention was focused on issues other than whether people were cheating at trade. And in my experience, there was a high tolerance for cheating, and we had to fight pretty hard to get people to realize that it was really, really hurting American industry, American workers, compromising our national security. So that's part of the reason I know that there's a real tendency to dismiss manufacturing in the US and to think that everything can be offshored. So there was just a whole way of thinking that had to change. And we had a fight in 2015 over whether the customs bill should be called the Customs Facilitation and Enforcement Bill. We wanted it to be called the Customs Enforcement and Facilitation Bill. So that's emblematic of that kind of fight. And I bring that up because that's a fight we've been having in the United States. I'm not sure other governments are necessarily at that point where there is this real focus on cheating and addressing cheating because cheating is unfair. This whole framework of using trade to find the lowest possible cost, whether that means you're using forced labor or you're ignoring your environmental obligations, you're not enforcing your rules, really led a lot of people to turn a blind eye to that kind of cheating. When we didn't want to do traditional free trade agreements, partly because the textile rules, thanks to people like Davis, are meant to really incentivize manufacturing among those trading partners. The rest of the industrial rules, except for maybe autos, are extremely leaky. So you get a lot of content from non-partners. That's not supposed to be the purpose of the agreement. So we said, coming out of the pandemic, we really need to rethink supply chains overall. We didn't do those tariff cuts. What we wanted to focus on was some of these other issues. And what I really wanted to focus on was some of this customs stuff. There was a step forward in USMCA to push for better customs to customs enforcement of the rules. That was a real step forward. What can we do with our other trading partners to continue to build that out? And in some of these developing economies, not being able to enforce at the border is depriving them of really basic revenue they need to run their governments. So we're not there yet. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. We were interested in blockchain as an opportunity to do that. It just takes a lot of elbow grease, and it's a different way of thinking than how the system has been hardwired for 30 years.
So both of you brought up blockchain, and I'd love to hear more about how that could be used to try and prevent customs fraud here, because I'll be honest with you, I still don't totally understand it. So if either of you could really jump in on that and maybe speak to how that could be used, that'd be incredible.
I can just speak on the fact that in general, we have incredible technology that's getting built for all types of industries, where traceability and can be at at your fingertip, and to be able to understand you need X number of inputs, X number of pounds, X number of units to produce this many finished garments, for instance, and to be able to track that to make sure that within every step of the supply chain, there is technology that is basically saying you're following the rules, you're compliant, green light, to allow Customs and Border Patrol not to have such a burden that they're facing today. I'd love to see some more technology like that. Again, all of our partners, we're all following the rules. Of course, we're complicit. There's always bad actors out there, but I think what this does, by having the confidence that we have technology to help with customs fraud, it allows companies like ours to continue to invest in the United States, to continue to invest in Honduras, in the other countries in which we have real confidence in the rules of origin, that we understand the rules, we understand what the competitive landscape is, and we're allowed to invest and have a fair chance with the other companies and countries that are participating in that value chain. The technology, I think, is needed to be able to make sure that the compliance is there, but in return, you get more investment, more confidence from companies like ours to invest in those regions. And that's one of the big things for me, why I'm passionate about the enforcement improvements, is so that it will create more confidence for other countries, for other companies to come invest in the United States and invest in these free trade agreements where we feel like we have strong confidence in compliance to the rules of origin.
And what I had heard from someone from the outside who was really encouraging us to look at this is that there's a way to compare export values on the outgoing side, import values on the incoming side, match those up, and start to take a look at who's being honest about what they're shipping out of the country and what you're bringing into the country. So that kind of technology where customs agencies across borders can work with each other to try to see who's gaming the system, that seems like a real opportunity. And I really want to stress, Davis, one of the things that struck me when we visited your facility was that label that you guys had on your product that allowed the tracing of the cotton all the way back. And what we saw out of the pandemic, if you want to fix some of these choke points that were exposed during the pandemic, you need to have much more visibility into the supply chain than we have right now. And what we found, I thought we were going to have all sorts of tools to be able to learn that information. It turns out to be hard. And some of the biggest companies in the world who told us they had first-in-class supply chain transparency, once you get past those first 3 or 4 tiers, they actually don't know. They're relying on word of mouth or people filling out forms until you get, unless it's conflict minerals. Conflict minerals, you're required by Dodd-Frank to trace those. So there's a big space there where we actually don't know what's going on, who's making what, or what kind of labor and environmental practices are involved. So if we can move and use technology to have much better awareness of what's in the supply chain, we'll be able to do a better job of tackling some of these problems.
Beth, I'd love to get your perspective on, something Davis talked about in the beginning was the sort of right. If you're trying to import into the U.S., it's very not from CAFTA or USMCA. It's very cheap, right? But if you're a U.S. exporter and you're trying to go to someplace else, there's not really reciprocity in that sense. One thing that we've talked about is having a sectoral approach to sort of trade in general. And can you talk a little bit about how having that sectoral approach and thinking about how, the tariffs that you want to have on, third-party countries that maybe aren't subject to one of your trade agreements like CAFTA or USMCA that have these fiber forward and yarn forward rule. Can you talk a little bit about how that sectoral approach could help solve that problem that Davis was describing?
Yeah, and this is where all the work that's been done on textiles and apparel is really important, and in some respects can be a model for how we approach other industries. You talked about fiber forward, Davis, yarn forward. When I started off a long time ago as a trade person, that requirement that the yarn originate in the trade agreement area was considered protectionist. So the fact that you were trying to incentivize production here was labeled as something we shouldn't be doing. And now, once we were in and we put out some papers at the end of the administration on supply chains, we said, look at what's so great about these yarn forward, fiber forward rules. You are forcing that stuff to be sourced in the region. That is promoting resilience. That's promoting nearshoring for those agreements that Davis was describing. So when you look at a particular sector and you focus on what you want out of that sector, you figure out if there are problematic actors in that sector in other countries, you can figure out how to structure the rules of that sector so that you're solving for that problem. And if you choose a sector, you're not ending up putting yourself in a situation of, well, I need to do this for a resilient textile and apparel industry, but I have to trade that off for agriculture or autos or pharmaceutical rules or investment rules. And you're really empowering yourself to respond to what is a very different era. We're just not in, whether you want to call it the neoliberal era, the free trade era, we're not in that era anymore. We have to be more thoughtful and strategic about how we go about these things. The other thing I want to say is how important it is that Davis emphasized the export orientation of your industry, because that's a little bit unusual in the US. All these agreements are often sold as this is going to be great for exports, and the US just isn't a huge exporter. My old boss, Ambassador Ty, used to say our superpower is consumption. We consume, and that's why everybody wants access to our market. So that lets us say, okay, Davis, you're export oriented. What kind of a tariff regime works for the textile and apparel industry? which might not be the same dynamic for a different industry where we consume most of what we make of that product here. And if we lower tariffs on that sector, we're inviting a flood of imports that is going to be problematic for that industry. So it lets you have a much more targeted approach as we think about how we're shifting from an old way of doing things towards something that is frankly probably just going to work better.
Yeah, Beth, I'm glad that you said that about the export mentality. 70, 80% of what we produce is exported. Our textile industry in the United States is a large exporter. We are the second largest textile exporter in the world. And I think if you were to ask academics and all the talking heads that always have opinions about trade and especially about our industry, I think they're shocked when they hear that. I think they're shocked to hear that our cotton farmers, our yarns, our fabrics are exported to countries that are normally considered lower cost than the United States. And we're able to do it competitively when the rules are fair and where there's rules-based trade agreements that are set up. We feel like our industry can do it just as well as anybody in the world when that playing field is fair. But again, we're not advocating, I'm not advocating right now that tomorrow all of the value chain, all the supply chain for apparel and other things could be reshored in the United States just like that, and you could have cost parity and things like that with the rest of the world. But one way to really do that, I think, in the first step is maybe we don't think as much about east to west, we think more north and south. We think more about the Western Hemisphere. And you think about how it's crazy almost to think that only 12 to 15% of what we consume in the United States, 12 to 15% of the apparel is imported in the Western Hemisphere. That shows you how dominant the Eastern and Asia is in the apparel and textile supply chains. I would say over the last 5 to 10 years, I think we can all agree that the cost competitiveness of the Western Hemisphere is now at parity or sometimes even better than some of the countries that for years and years we heard about in Asia. If we were to shift from 12 to 15 to 20%, which doesn't sound radical at all when you're considering the entire Western Hemisphere, if we were able just to make a small improvement to 20%, thousands and thousands of jobs, not only in the United States, but throughout the Northern Triangle and throughout the Western Hemisphere, and primarily, I believe, in those regions that have established free trade agreements. We could create a ton of jobs doing that and continue to see big investment, not only in the Northern Triangle, not only in Central and South America, but here in the United States. Our company is a perfect example of that. Because of our relationship that we've had as an exporter to CAFTA, to USMCA, but also because of our domestic base, we've been able to invest over the last 15 years close to $500 million in automation, in innovation, in the United States, solely in the United States, because we are a participant in these export markets. So it's beneficial not only for U.S. workers, but also for our investments in Honduras, Mexico, Colombia, and other countries where those free trade agreements and rules of origin are established.
Thing you said earlier, Davis, too, on the jobs was that your industry is a 3-to-1 multiplier. Can you dig into that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I'm just passionate about in general, and I feel very grateful. I love what I do. I love this textile industry. We have an amazing U.S. textile industry. And being a manufacturer, I think I have a lot of passion in general about being a manufacturer. We create products, we're able to innovate. And most manufacturing jobs, textile jobs included, have a certain multiplier. In the textile industry, it's 3-to-1. And meaning if I can create one job on one of our floors, I can hire a new engineer. It's got a 3-to-1 multiplier, meaning that 3 other indirect jobs are created with that one hire. And so you think about the vendors, you think about companies that help support us with technology, with parts, you think about local municipalities that help support these large facilities that we have. Some of our facilities are 500,000 to 1 million square feet to operate. They take a lot of energy, they take a lot of investment, a lot of raw materials. One of our facilities, for instance, in Gaffney, South Carolina, could literally consume every bale of cotton grown in the state of South Carolina based on the size of that facility. Now, we don't, because we use from a lot of different states, but having investments like that, the seed providers, the cotton growers, the farmers, the distributors on the raw materials, the parts manufacturers, electronics, companies that help service manufacturing companies, all benefit when we're able to create a manufacturing job. The other thing about manufacturing jobs, you know, that in the United States that I believe in, you're getting 40 to 48 hours a week if you work for a manufacturing company. You look at other industries, United States service level jobs, you're maybe getting 26 to 28. And you're hearing people talk about, I have to work 2 or 3 jobs at a time because of this economy. Let me tell you, you can get 40 to 48 hours working for a manufacturing, working on coding, working as an engineer in a facility, getting higher pay, hourly pay, 40 to 48 hours a week, 401k, good health care benefits, and plenty of ways to kind of get promoted. A lot of the people that work in our company at the highest levels all started on our floor. Manufacturing in the United States allows you to do that. And so that's something I have a lot of pride in, you know, being a US manufacturer.
Davis, one of the things we had heard, this is maybe more of a comment, but you reminded me of it, because a lot of people who are dismissive of reshoring, especially of textiles and apparel, think that these are really brutal, menial jobs. And what you're describing, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is a combination of automation and job creation, so that you're automating the backbreaking stuff that's really hard on people. But by being able to automate that, you're able to create jobs that are more value added. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And I go back to the example I gave earlier for the Gaffney, South Carolina facility, in which I mentioned the cotton consumption. You know, that facility, for what it produces per week, what its capability to produce per week, back in the 80s would require over 1,000 workers full-time, 24/7, 365. You know, we operate that facility with less than 150 today. And the reasons for that has been the constant reinvestment in technology. And instead of some of the processes that we had in the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s, we replaced those processes with AGVs, automatic guided vehicles, with robotics, with types of innovation that require engineers and a different skill set than in what we had in the, you know, required in the 90s and early 2000s. And so not only are we reinvesting, I think, on the equipment to make better quality, to make lower cost, higher productivity, but we're also reinvesting in changing, you know, the type of workers and the types of skills that we need in those facilities. And that's been constantly changing. So I think most of the, you know, non-value add kind of jobs that we heard about a long time ago, yeah, we've had to automate those, and we've had technological advancements to help basically create better, more skilled technical jobs in our facilities.
That this has been fascinating. I'm trying to think if I have anything else that I need to make sure I ask. Beth, what about you?
I wonder, Davis, if you could talk, as we close things out, about the role of Parkdale in the community.
Sure. Again, I can speak for Parkdale, but I think I speak for a lot of other American manufacturing companies. They're deeply ingrained in the communities in which they operate. In some of the communities in which we operate, we're the largest employer. And we take a lot of pride in paying good wages. We take a lot of pride in good health benefits, 401ks, promotion. That's something that we've been around for 100 years and something that we take a lot of pride in. If you walk around our office here, you see a lot of nameplates with 30, 40, 50 years of service in our company. And I think that's unique. I think that's unique about our culture, but I see that in a lot of manufacturing companies. I see that in a lot of US manufacturing companies that have invested in facilities, but they're also investing in the community. Our shareholders at this company are actively involved in all the communities, giving back. We had a terrible, I'll give you one example. We had a terrible incident with hurricane up at our Mountain City facility in which it got flooded. That whole part of the state was devastated recently. And, we're able to put away funds to make sure those people are able to pay their bills and to be relocated to the other existing facilities that we operate in. Every single one of them that wanted a job got placed, and we were able to provide funds for them during that transition time, in which, quite frankly, the government wasn't doing much. And so, companies like that, we see examples like that across industry in all types of communities. But when you're one of the largest providers and your people mean so much to you, which, here at Parkdale, our people and our team is everything. We take a lot of pride, not only investing in our facilities, but in the communities in which we operate, for sure.
Thank you so much for joining. I think for me that this has been an incredible conversation, and I just want to say thanks to both of you. I really appreciate getting this opportunity. I couldn't imagine two better people to have this different perspectives, but to have this conversation with. So I feel very
Thank you for having me, Neil. And again, real honor to be even included for the conversation with such all-stars like Beth and Ambassador Ty. We as an industry really appreciate all their efforts in the previous administration, and hopefully people will continue to listen to experts like Beth.
Thank you so much. I've heard you talk before, Davis, and I always learn something new. So thank you very much.
Thank you both.